I'm not just sneaking in.
Oh, got it.
Hey, excuse me. You wouldn't mind sitting in my seat there? You're a tall guy with live streaming.
Oh, sure. No problem. Although I wouldn't mind getting famous on YouTube.
Awesome, thanks so much.
What's the back of my head anyway?
Yeah. Say just turn around every 30 seconds.
Yeah, there you go.
You're all ready to go?
Yep.
Okay, cool. Like next 2 minutes, we'll probably start up. that's sort of unspoken.
Yep, I'll send
and
you.
so, as you can guess, we're a big fan of him here at the club. So, without further ado, I want to welcome Dr. Jordan Burt Peterson to the stage.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here again, Vancouver. So, well, thank you. That's much appreciated. So, all right, I'm going to get right into it. I signed all these books. It was a pleasure. It takes about 7 seconds a book. Get yourselves oriented. Okay, so I'm going to walk through my book today. I'll see if I can touch on all 12 of the rules. It probably won't happen because I usually get like obsessed with one of them partway through, but I'm going to try anyway. So, and I'll start with rule 1, logically enough, which is stand up straight with your shoulders back. And I'm actually going to start by talking about a different book. I've been reading this book over the last couple of weeks called The Great Leveler by Walter Scheidel. That's The Great Leveler. I would really recommend this book, by the way. Since you've already bought mine, I can recommend another one. The reason I bought this book was because I had this client once in my clinical practice. He was a fascinating guy. He was an old guy. And he'd come to me because he was completely obsessed with mathematics and he couldn't get it out of his mind. And he had some other issues as well. And he did all sorts of interesting things. He made these little gold pins out of the world's most beautiful equation, and he used to hand them out to students. And he had studied psychology and he had studied finance. And I think I learned more from him in my dealings with him in the therapeutic context than he learned from me. That's not that rare if you're a clinical psychologist, because if you're talking to people deeply, the probability that you're going to learn something from them is unbelievably high. And so I think probably if you're not learning something from your clients every time you talk to them, then you're probably not on the right track from a therapeutic perspective. And I kind of allude to that in rule 9, which is assume that the person that you're listening to knows something you don't, which is a very good rule. Anyways, he introduced me to this thing I've talked about an awful lot, which was a principle derived by an Italian economist named Vilfredo Pareto. And Pareto was the person who formulated the Pareto principle, which is that it's a very terrible principle. It's the principle that if you have 10 employees, then 3 of them do half the work. It's a square root principle, fundamentally. And the square root principle seems to apply to every single domain where there's creative variability in human endeavor. But it also seems to apply to domains outside of human endeavor and even living endeavor altogether. It applies to the population of cities and massive stars, for example, which seems to make it a principle that goes beyond, well, certainly beyond the sociological, beyond the biological. It's grounded deeply into the physical. And anyways, the square root law goes something like this. So the square root of the number of people in a given domain do half the productive work. And so, or reap half the benefit. Think, well, all right, if you have 10 employees, then 3 of them do half the work. That's not that surprising. If you have 10 employees, one of them is probably not doing that well, and the other 2 are sort of, dragging their feet. Another 3 might be making enough money to pay their own wages, and then you have 3 that are productive enough so that they're really running the entire enterprise. So 3 out of 10, that's not too bad. That's not that much less than 50%. But if it's 100, then 10 of them do half the productive work, and if it's 1,000, then it's 30, and if it's 10,000, then it's 100. I mean, so what happens is, in enterprises, competence grows linearly and incompetence grows exponentially. Right. And this, you just cannot overstate the seriousness of this. It's absolutely, it's why I think the story of the Tower of Babel exists at the end of chapter 1, or the first part of Genesis. If something gets too big, it will absolutely collapse. And the reason for that is that competence grows linearly and incompetence grows exponentially. And so you remember in 2008, everyone said too big to fail. It's like, no. So big, it must fail. And I think this is actually a place where the right and the left could agree if they got beyond their partisan differences, because of course the right is very, very suspicious of big government, and the left is very, very suspicious of big government. And you might think, of big business. And you might think that someone canny would stand back and say, well, look, the common denominator there seems to be big. And that's very much worth pointing out. Now, this old guy, he told me about the Pareto principle, and it solved a problem that I had encountered in my research. I was doing research with Shelley Carson and Daniel Higgins. We started this research at Harvard in the 90s, and we were very interested in the measure of creativity. And creativity, like many commonly utilized descriptive terms, is very difficult to nail down from a scientific perspective, because to nail down something from a scientific perspective, you really have to put it in a categorical box, right? You can't, if I use the word creativity in a normal conversation, you can pick up what I mean from the context of the conversation, but if I make a measure of creativity, then it has to be very, very tightly defined. And it turns out that defining something like creativity is a lot more difficult than you might think. So, because one of the things you could say is, well, people think creatively. Maybe you're a creative thinker. Is that creativity? Well, or you might think, well, no, that's not enough. Creativity isn't merely the ability to think creatively. You have to produce something that's novel and useful, which is a fairly common definition. Creative people produce things that are novel and useful. There were quite a few measures of creative thinking already established in the psychometric literature. One of them is the Torrance creativity test. Is quite widely used. It's actually a pretty good predictor of creative endeavor, as it turns out. So with the Torrance tests, you're asked, for example, to write down as many uses as you can think of for a brick in, I think it's 5 minutes. I don't remember the exact amount of time. And then you're scored for absolute number of responses. The more, the better. That's a straight fluency measure. That's called a fluency measure. And then the other thing that you're scored on is relative rarity of your response, as long as it still fits within the domain of both novel and useful. And so that would be creative thinking. And fluency measures are also measures of extroversion and trait openness from a Big Five perspective. And so you could tell, like if I got like about 400 of you here, if I all had you write down as many words as you can that begin with the letter S in 90 seconds, and we rank ordered you by how many words you generated, we'd get a rough rank order of your creativity as well. And some estimation of your verbal intelligence, but it would be a better measure of creativity, at least creative thinking. And creative thinkers think laterally. And so what happens if you're a creative thinker is you'll have an idea and then it'll give rise to a bunch of other ideas. So you have loose associational networks. That's another way of thinking about it. You know, someone who's not creative, if you toss them an idea, another idea won't rapidly spring to mind. Or if it does, it'll be an idea that's quite close semantically to the original idea. Whereas if you're a creative person, you'll hit an idea and you'll jump way over here, and that'll remind you of something way over here, and that'll remind you of something way over here. And a lot of creative thinking is bad thinking. You know, well, it is. Look, I mean, it's an important thing to know if you're a creative person, because it's really hard to monetize creativity, right? Because first of all, most of your ideas are bad. They're just not well thought through. You haven't criticized them. Even if they're good ideas, the probability that there's a market for them is quite low at that time and in that place. And like, what do you know about marketing anyways? And then you have to communicate them. And like, it's really, the pathway from creative idea to profitable creative product is so long that it's almost never that the originator of a creative idea monetizes it. And so that's a very dismal proposition for people who are creative. It's very, like, creative people generate all the new ideas, right? But they hardly ever monetize them. Other people monetize them. So it's a hell of a thing to be a creative person, except that it's interesting. Anyways, that's the thing, that's the payoff, right? It's interesting. You have an interesting life if you're a creative, maybe too interesting. So when we had been studying, so we decided to study creative achievement. We put together this questionnaire called the Creative Achievement Questionnaire. And what we did was we identified 13 dimensions of potential creative production, things like culinary, architectural, entrepreneurial, financial, dance, drama, art, literature, etc. I think there was an invention category. Anyways, we covered the creative domains pretty well. And then we had experts. We ranked different, what would you call it, strata of accomplishment. So 0 would be, I have no training or recognized talent in this area. And like 10, I think it was on a 10-point scale, would be, I won an international prize for my work in this area. And then we gave it to many, many, many people and looked at IQ as a predictor. IQ is a very good predictor, by the way. IQ predicts almost everything that involves complex cognitive operations. And IQ is the most powerful predictor social scientists have ever found for anything, period, by a factor of about 4. Well, there's one exception. The correlation between inequality and male homicide is about 0.9, and that's the highest correlation between two things I've ever seen. But other than that, it's IQ. And so IQ was a good predictor. Trait openness in the big 5 sense was a good predictor of creative ability. But one of the things we found was that the distribution of creative achievement was not normal. You know how a normal distribution works is most people are at the average, and then a few people are at the tails. And that applies to IQ, and it applies to height, it applies to weight, and it applies to the big 5 traits. And there's a truism in psychology that most phenomena are normally distributed. A truism in statistics, actually, that most phenomena are normally distributed. But creative achievement is not normally distributed. And neither are any of the phenomena that are associated with creative production in general, including the distribution of money, for example. The 1% has the 1% has a disproportionate amount of wealth. And then if you take the 1% of the 1%, they have a disproportionate amount of the wealth that the 1% has, so that it's something like 85 people have as much money as the bottom 2.5 billion. It's something like that. And you think, well, that's a terrible indictment of the capitalist system. And no, it's not, by the way, because the problem of inequality, which is a real problem, is way more serious and difficult than the problem of capitalism. Because inequality is a much more fundamental phenomena, because it manifests itself in all sorts of areas that have nothing to do with sociology or politics or economics. It manifests itself everywhere. Now, and what we found with the Creative Achievement Questionnaire was everyone stacked up at 0. It's like across the 13 dimensions, 70%, 70% of people scored 0, and about 10% scored 1. And and you could easily score like 60. People scored 60 on the Creative Achievement Test, so the distribution looked like this. Everybody stacked up at 0, and there was a few people out here, and they were doing everything. And that's what you see. You see that in scientific publications. You see it in hockey goals scored. You see it in number of compositions written. Like how many classical compositions have you written? 0, right? None. Right. And then you have J.S. Bach, who wrote so many classical compositions that if you hired a competent copyist just to copy what he composed, it would take them 40 years of 8-hour days. So that's J.S. Bach. And then Picasso, here's an example. So Picasso, you're no Picasso, well that's for sure. How many paintings have you painted? 0. How many paintings did Picasso paint? Artworks. How many artworks did Picasso produce? 65,000. Right, so 3 a day, every day, for 65 years. Right, and think about it, it's just absolutely beyond and these were Picassos, right? Right, no, but I'm dead serious. You think, yeah, he's whipping off some sketches. It's like, no. You can go online, you can find the online Picasso archive, and there's 15,000 of his pieces of art. Last I checked, which was a couple of years ago, it's probably more like 20,000 now. And it's just staggering. You just cannot believe that someone could possibly do that. And really, that's the way of the world. And so this old guy, he told me about the Pareto distribution, and that blew me away to begin. So that explained the creative achievement questionnaire distribution, because we didn't know. It's like, what the hell? This is supposed to be normally distributed. It's not even, it's not normally distributed at all. Everybody stacks up at 0, which is like a rule to remember. The proclivity is for everyone to stack up at 0. And well, why? Well, 0 is easy, right? You just don't have anything. It's like that's the natural state of things, is to not have anything. And so it's not surprising that people stack up at 0. What's surprising is that some people don't. And then what else is surprising is how unbelievably hyper-productive people are. It's just beyond belief. I mean, Nikolai Tesla, who invented alternating current, that actually turns out to be a big deal. He invented the electric motor and the electric generator, among endless other inventions. He said that whole inventions would pop into his mind in one burst, right down to the angle of the screws, or the screws that held the mechanisms together. And sometimes he would invent things so quickly that he couldn't get one written down before another would pop into his head and obliterate the previous one. And Mozart as well claimed, and Mozart was a little more understandable because he was unbelievably highly trained by his father as well as being a prodigy. But he said whole symphonies would pop into his head at once, and it was just a matter of writing it down. And so creative achievement is really something. And it's not like we understand it, but it's rare, and the people who are really good at it are prolific beyond belief. And so when you hear about the 1% having all the money, you think, well, that's a side effect of some pathological system. It's like, no. Don't get oversimplified about this. It's a big problem. Now, anyway, so this old guy, he explained to me part of the reasons that the Pareto distribution emerged, say with regards to the money. And so it's complicated, and this is why Walter Scheidel's book is also extremely useful. I mean, one of the things that seems to happen is that IQ has nonlinear effects. So, and you can imagine why that might be, because if you're the first person to get somewhere, then, except if you're creative, but if you're the first person to get somewhere, then you're more likely to benefit disproportionately from getting there, because you're the first person. And so, if you have a high IQ, then you're faster than everyone else. And then if you align that also with the fact that you're going to network with other high IQ people, which is exactly what's happening in Silicon Valley, for example, then that starts to become exponentially more worthwhile. And that's the thing, too, is that this is also associated with the Pareto distribution. There's another kind of iron law of economics, which is a very sad law. They call it the Matthew principle, often, which is an allusion, oddly enough, to a New Testament statement. And the New Testament statement is, to those who have everything, more will be given. And from those who have nothing, everything will be taken. And that's sort of aligned with another New Testament statement, which is, the poor will be with us always. And, well, those are pretty strange statements for what purports to be an ethical document. But I think what they do is to point to something that's very, very deep about the way that wealth is both generated and distributed. And so there's nonlinear advantages to, say, having a higher IQ. There's potentially nonlinear advantages to having higher rates of conscientiousness. There's potentially nonlinear effects to being a creative thinker. But then once you start being successful, like you might think you start being successful and then it's a linear trend upwards. Or you start failing and it's a linear trend downwards. But it doesn't look like it graphs that way. It looks like as you start being successful, each success makes the next success more probable. So it looks like this. And as you fail, each failure makes the next failure more probable. So it looks like this. So there's scaling up on one side, rapid, and there's falling off a cliff on the other side, equally rapid. And so that's the Matthew principle, and those things operating together seem to produce this Pareto distribution. And the problem with the Pareto distribution, as Marx pointed out 120 years ago, he thought it was attributable to capitalism, is that capital, say, tends to accumulate in the hands of fewer and fewer individuals. Now, Marx was right about that, but Pareto had already figured that out. I think Pareto predated Marx, although I'm not absolutely certain of that. I'm hoping that it's true anyways. But Marx wasn't pessimistic enough, and modern-day left-wingers aren't pessimistic enough either, because, of course, what drives politics on the left is the observations of inequality and the potentially catastrophic effects of inequality. And there are potentially catastrophic effects of inequality. That's the thing. That's also well documented. So if you're a good social scientist, you should know something about the Pareto distribution. You should know something about the fact that creative achievement is a nonlinear process, and so is success. You should know something about the fact that IQ predicts lifetime performance, as does conscientiousness, although not nearly as well. And that there's this proclivity for success to cascade and for failure to cascade. But you should also know that, and I think this is credible evidence, that as inequality increases, as it seems to do inexorably, societies themselves destabilize. So I mentioned earlier the two correlations that I know of that are very large. One is IQ predicting life success, and the other is Margaret Wilson and Martin Daly, at McMaster University. These are the first people who discovered this. It was shocking research when I first came upon it, because I'd never seen anything that was this powerful in the social sciences. So they were interested in what drives male homicide. And I had studied aggression in males. Well, males are more aggressive than females. And I'll talk about that in a little while. It's not a huge difference, by the way. So if you took a random woman and a random man out of the population, and you had to bet on who was more aggressive, and you bet on the man, you'd be right 60% of the time. So there's a huge amount of overlap between men and women with regards to aggression. And this is another thing you might want to understand. It's really important to understand this, is that two groups can be very similar with walloping differences at the tails. So here's an example. So let's say the overlap between men and women is substantial with regards to aggression. But let's say we don't care about aggression except when we're talking about the person who's the most aggressive out of 100. And you can imagine that would be the case, because you don't really care if someone's aggressive as long as they don't come into your house with a gun, right? They can be pretty damn aggressive, but when they cross that line into outright aggressive criminality, then they've hit a threshold, and that threshold essentially means incarceration. So you might say, well, what proportion of men are the most aggressive people? And the answer to that is something like 9 out of 10. It depends on how you slice it, obviously. But the more aggressive the slice, the higher the proportion of men. And that's why 9 out of 10 people in prison are men, even though on average men and women don't differ that much in aggression. And so it's really important as well, and this should be taught, basic statistics, somewhat sophisticated, I would say, but that kind of statistics needs to be taught to people in junior high and high school, because otherwise you can't understand easily the way the world works. You can't understand how men and women can be mostly the same, but they can still be really different at the extremes, and a lot of activity occurs at the extremes. You can say the same thing about men in engineering and women in nursing. So the evidence on this is becoming increasingly clear. First of all, the more gender equal the state, the bigger the difference in interest between men and women. Now, it's exactly the opposite of what social scientists assumed they'd find 25 years ago, because everyone assumed, and hoped perhaps, that as you made societies more gender neutral in their sociological structure, that the personality differences between men and women would decrease. That's not what happened. They maximized. And it's because you take all the environmental variability out of the equation, you're left with nothing but biological variability, and it maximizes. And so there's a new paper that was just posted today on exactly this topic, showing that the most gender neutral countries have the biggest differences in educational choice. And so it's really interesting, and you see our damn government keeps rattling the cage about STEM fields and about how the fact that women are underrepresented in STEM means that there's sociological bias. All the bias, by the way, in terms of hiring with regards to STEM fields is in favor of women now. The empirical data on that is absolutely crystal clear. And so whatever's driving the difference in hiring, and there isn't undergraduate rates of graduation either. And it's not proficiency, because if you look at proficiency in mathematical reasoning and scientific ability, mathematical reasoning in particular among junior high kids, women and men or girls and boys, basically indistinguishable. And if you follow up high achieving women from junior high who are disproportionately intelligent in mathematics, what happens is they don't go into mathematics or into the STEM fields because they're not interested in it. It's not because they can't do it. It's a really important thing to know, right? It isn't differences in ability that's driving this. It's difference in interest, and the difference in interest between men and women are the biggest psychometric differences that we know of between the genders, bigger than personality differences, for example, which are also big enough to have walloping effects at the tails, although not that big at the average. So anyways, back to this old guy. He said to me, he'd been thinking a lot about the creative distribution, and his theory was there are a lot of factors that drive the distribution of wealth, because he was most concerned about wealth. But what happens is that as a society ratchets forward, the proclivity for wealth to distribute itself unequally mounts and mounts and mounts and mounts until there's so many people stacked up at zero that they flip the board over, because zero is a really difficult place to escape from. You know, you can fall into a poverty trap where you're so poor that nothing you do gets you going. You can't get any traction. You kind of know that if you ever try to start a business, because the most difficult customer to find for your business is the first customer. It's disproportionately difficult. Once you find one, the second one is way easier. And once you have 100, it's like, well, the 101st is relatively simple. But that first paying customer, yeah, good luck with that, man. It's virtually impossible. So his idea was that and I can tell you some other interesting things about this too. He turned me on to the work of a group of people called econophysicists, and I thought, what? Econophysicists? Those people don't exist. And yeah, they do, by the way. And you can go look online, and they have interesting animations, the econophysicists. And one of the things they do, here's a way of imagining how wealth distributes itself. So imagine that I gave everybody in the room $10. Okay, so you all have $10. And so you're at a state of maximal equality, right? And now you start to engage in a trading game. And it's a simple trading game. You just go up to someone and you flip a coin, and if it's heads, then you buy a fictional banana from them and eat it, and you give them $1. And so you walk away with 9 and they walk away with 11. And you just keep trading. Okay, so what happens first is that the stack, imagine a graph. Everyone's stacked up at $10. Now you start to trade. Just as many people win as lose. So you get a normal distribution first. But then, after 10 bad trades, some poor sucker has 10 tails in a row, and then they hit 0. Well, what happens when you hit 0? You're out of the game, man. You're done. And so then everyone keeps trading. So what happens? Well, the distribution starts to turn from a normal distribution. This tail starts to stack up as people stack up at 0. The zeros mount. And then the number of people who are winning the trades gets smaller and smaller and smaller until one person has all the money. Now you know that because you play Monopoly. Right? That's what happens in a Monopoly game. The game is over when one person wins everything. And so you can model this. So this is such a robust phenomenon that you can model it with a Monopoly game. And so we really do understand this. Now the problem that my old client said, well, the problem with regards to the proclivity of money to distribute itself in that manner, with regards to the econophysicists, so that was one of the graphs they produced. They also showed that money tends to distribute itself in a society and can be modeled by the same equations as gas distributing itself into a vacuum. That's another example of how fundamental a problem this is. This is a fundamental problem, and it can't be hand-waved away with some reference to, the vagaries of political systems. So that was his hypothesis, is that, well, the game kept going until too few people won everything, and then there'd be a revolution, because the people at the bottom, especially the angry young males, because they're very status conscious, and if they can't lift themselves off the bottom rung, then they're not interesting to women, and so they're not in the dating game, the mating game at all, and that makes them hyper-aggressive, and that's what's driving the correlation between male homicide and inequality, which is about 0.9, as I said. So if you go to counties across, this is between countries and within countries, by the way. It's absolutely robust data. And so what you find is if you go places where everyone's poor, the men aren't violent. And if you go places where everyone's rich, the men aren't violent. But if you go places where there's a steep gradient between rich and poor, so neighborhoods that are mixed economically, let's say, then the male homicide rate starts to ratchet up. And you can imagine that it's the most aggressive males by temperament that get most aggressive soonest as inequality increases. So there's still a psychological component, but what's driving it fundamentally is inequality. And so the reason when I first, that was Martin Daly and Margot Wilson's work. They're both Canadian, they're at McMaster, and brilliant work. They also demonstrated, because they studied homicides in Chicago, in the inner cities, and they concluded that for a typical inner city dweller in Chicago, homicide was an effective status move with regards to moving yourself up the hierarchy. Because you'd be in a within race competition, first of all, because most murders occur within race, and so most of that was dominance dispute, and you'd plea bar, and then if it was the sort of fight that turned into a murder, the sort of dispute that turned into a murder, you could claim self-defense, plea bargain it down to manslaughter, you'd be in jail hypothetically for 3 years, but you'd get out after 18 months, and your street cred would rise enough so that it was actually a viable economic decision. It's harsh modeling, right? Like real social science produces results that no one likes. That's how you can tell. That's how you can tell if the findings are real. If you're a social scientist and you go, oh no. Yeah, it's really the case. And that's why I think you can trust the gender data on personality, by the way, because, you know, it's a truism that the social sciences are left-leaning. That's to say the least. They're left-leaning. And so the fact that social scientists have found that gender differences in personality maximize in egalitarian societies, like that's rock solid data. Because no one was like having a party when they discovered that. No one was going, oh, that's exactly what we're hoping. Isn't it good we got that out of the data? It's like, no, that can't be right. We better like quadruple our sample size and do 10 more analysis. Oh, there it is again. Oh, well, I guess we have to publish this. That's the lines of thinking. So another example of that, I would say, is this is also with regards to inequality, is that I spent a lot of time reading the IQ literature. I started that about 20 years ago, and I was reading that because, well, I was interested in what predicts human performance across time, and IQ definitely does. IQ measures, by the way, they're very easy to design. So I'll tell you how to make an IQ test. It's real simple. So imagine that you had a universal library of questions. I don't care what kind of questions they are. Mathematical puzzles, verbal puzzles, general knowledge, vocabulary, like any sort of question that someone could answer and that maybe some people couldn't. So they'd have to be questions with a certain degree of difficulty. So imagine you have 100,000 questions like that. You just throw them in a pile. And then you randomly select 100 of them. And then you give them to 400 people, and you tally up their scores, and you rank order the scores. That's IQ. Not exactly. You should correct for age. But forget about that. Fundamentally, that's IQ. And then what you find, so you took those 100 random questions and you gave them to everyone, you rank ordered their performance. Let's say you pulled out another 100, and you gave them to the same 400 people, and you produced another rank order, right? And you correlated the two rank orders. You'd find that the correlation was about 0.93, something like that. So the people who did really well on the first 100 set of questions are overwhelmingly likely to be the people who do very well on the second set of 100 questions. And that's all there is to IQ. That's the whole damn picture. Now, and that predicts long-term life success with enough potency. So imagine you were picking people for a job and used an IQ test to pick them, or you chose them randomly. So if you chose them randomly, there'd be a 50% failure rate. If you chose them with an IQ test, there'd be a 25% failure rate. And so it's a walloping effect. And everyone knows that. I mean, really, you know perfectly well that complex cognitive operations are easier for smart people. It's like that's just not that staggering a realization. Everyone knows that, right? But we're not so happy about the corollary, which is that complex cognitive operations are very, very difficult for people who aren't smart. We don't like that. And no wonder, right? Because it's a terrible thing. So anyways, the US military has been doing IQ testing since like 1919. Really, really early. And you think, well, why? Well, partly because during times of emergency, like wartime, when you have to ramp up, or else, then maybe you want to figure out a way to select people rapidly so you can figure out who should be officers and who should be soldiers quickly so like you don't lose the war. It's actually very important. And so the Army, the Armed Forces in the US did a lot of IQ research and established a lot of the basic psychometric understanding of IQ. And about 20 years ago, might be longer than that, there's a new law passed in the United States with regards to inducting people into the armed forces. So imagine first, here's another example reliable social science. Okay, so now you run the armed forces. So what's your problem? The first problem is manpower shortage, especially if it's wartime. But even in peacetime, it's hard to get enough people into the military. So what's your goal? Take everyone you possibly can. That's your goal, right? And let's say it's wartime, that's bloody obvious. You want to take everyone you can. But then there's another layer, which is, let's say it's peacetime, and you want to keep the armed forces functional. But you also want the armed forces to play another role, which they could play, which would be to take people from the underclass, right, the people who stacked up at zero, and train them to do something useful, and move them into the working class, or maybe even to the middle class, because the armed forces, particularly in the US, have been used as an avenue of social mobility, and logically so. Okay, so then you have people who are doing the research, who are damn motivated to take everyone they can, and also to believe that training will work. Because that's what you'd hope. If you're going to take everyone, you're going to hope that training will work, obviously. What did the armed forces conclude? If you have an IQ of less than 83, it's illegal to induct you into the armed forces. You think, well, so what? Yeah, so what? 1 in 10. Right. So you think about that. Among the most desperate employers in the United States, the conclusion has been that 10% of the population is without sufficient cognitive resources to do anything in a reasonably complex cognitive environment that isn't positively counterproductive. And so that's, right, it's a catastrophe. It's a catastrophe because, the liberals think, well, we're all equal. You can train someone to do anything. It's like, no, you can't. That's wrong. It's not just wrong. It's unbelievably wrong. It's seriously wrong. And then the conservatives think, well, there's a job for everybody if they just get off their lazy ass and do it. It's like, no. No, that's what we're doing. No, I mean, if you are in the lower quintile of cognitive ability and you're highly conscientious, you work hard, that does increase your chances of gainful employment. But look, here's the data, basically. People with an IQ of 90 or less, and that's more like 1 in 4, something like that, maybe more, probably more, can't read well enough to follow instructions. Right. Think about that. Because I don't know what your definition of literacy is. Literacy isn't puzzling out words. Right, you're not literate until you're not puzzling out words at all. You're not even puzzling out phrases, right? You've automatized your reading ability to the point where you look at a word and you instantly read it, but even more so that you glance at a phrase and you're not figuring out what the words are, you're interacting with the meaning of the words. Okay, let's call that literacy. Okay, 90 IQ and below? No. Okay, so that's, and this is something I'm dwelling on this book because I'm obsessed with the idea of inequality and the unequal and the unequal, what would you call it, distribution of creative ability. It's an obsession because it's so important. But, the thing is that we're producing a landscape around us that's increasingly cognitively complex, right? Like, how well are you going to do at your damn job if you can't use a computer, for example? It's like using a computer, that's not that easy, It's not a simple thing. And if you're not literate, then good luck to you in using your damn computer. I had another client who, he must have had an IQ about, I would think somewhere between 70 and 80. That was just one of many, many problems he had. And I tried to teach him to fold up paper and put it in an envelope, and because he had a job that required that. And I watched him do that, and it's really hard to fold a paper in three and put it in an envelope, because the envelope is exactly the same size as the paper, width-wise, right? It's exactly the same size. So and you have to fold twice, and so if you're out by 2 millimeters on each fold, the paper won't fit into the envelope. And that's not, and it's the same in terms of the width of the folded paper, right? You have to fold it exactly in 3 for it to fit in the envelope. And if you have what do you call a volunteer job where your job is to fold letters and put them in envelopes, you have to do that precisely and accurately at high speed. Oh, he couldn't do it. I trained him for like 26 hours, something like that. It just made him sweat. And it was really, really hard on him. And he had a bit of a tremor, and he had other problems as well. But it was so funny. I mean, it was impossible to find him a job. trying to find someone a volunteer job, you think trying to find someone a real job is hard. You just try getting them a volunteer job. You have to do a police screening, for example. And then you have to do the paperwork for that. So it's like, forget that, that wasn't happening. And I sent him off, this was in Ontario, I sent him off to, there was some government agency that had been set up under the last Conservative Party to help people who, you know, were looking for work. And they had specialists hired. And he told them to, oh, you know, type up your resume and distribute it. It's like, yeah, okay, that's, that was not helpful. It's like, no typing, no resume. That's a big problem. You know? And so there are way more people out there like that than you think. Way more. And we do not know what to do about that. And blaming it on capitalism isn't going to help, because it's not the fault of capitalism. But also ignoring the fact that inequality exists and that people tend to stack up at zero, and that there are massive differences in individual productivity, and that people are rewarded disproportionately. Ignoring all that, that's not going to help either. And so, okay, so back to, so anyway, so this old guy, I mean, introduced me to this world, and I thought, that was just, first of all, I couldn't believe that I had been trained as a psychologist for like 25 years, something like that. Maybe it's only 15. Anyways, it was plenty long enough. And I'd never heard of a Pareto distribution, and I thought that most things were normally distributed, and that was just like seriously wrong. I couldn't believe that I hadn't encountered that somewhere. It still staggers me because it's such a fundamental phenomenon. And his idea was, well, you know, inequality mounts up and then there's revolution. So, well, so then, because if you stack up at zero, why not flip the board? You know, if you're down to your last $10 and you're playing Monopoly and you're going to get shot when you lose, then you might as well flip the board over and start a new game. There's just no reason to participate when you're stuck at zero. Even if there's a high chance of mortality by playing a new game, you might as well risk it, especially if you're male. And that is exactly what characterizes the history of the human race. So Scheidel wrote this book, The Great Leveler, and I've just been working my way through it. And I read a description, and he basically came up with the same theory that this old client of mine had come up with, that inequality mounts inexorably, and then there's revolutions. And so Scheidel went through the data going back, well, as far back as you can go, 15,000 years, sometimes even, if you go back into Neolithic burial cemeteries, you can get an estimate of the dollar value of the artifacts that are buried with people. And then you can graph the dollar value of the artifacts, and you can see what sort of distribution there is. And there's a Pareto distribution, right? There's a few guys that are buried with like gold sheathing, and there's like one of them in the cemetery, and then there's, you know, 100 people who are buried with absolutely nothing. And so you can track it there. And he tracked inequality among hunter-gatherers. If there's no surplus, there's not much inequality. There's still inequality of health, there's inequality of social contacts, and there's inequality of sexual success, even when there's no surplus of material wealth. So you can't get rid of inequality even if you get rid of surplus material wealth. Once you introduce surplus material wealth, which you probably want to do because otherwise everyone's living hand to mouth, then inequality starts ramping up inexorably. And so, and that's true. Now, he did a number of very interesting analysis. One question was, well, there are continual attempts to ameliorate inequality across the centuries, across the eons, right? Because it's a fundamental problem. If you analyze the relationship between the position of a government on the ideological spectrum and inequality, do you find any relationship? And the answer is no. It doesn't matter if it's a left-wing government or a right-wing government. It has no effect whatsoever on inequality. No one knows what to do about it. And so the only thing that Scheidel found helped, there were four things, and I don't know if I'll remember all of them, but he called them the four horsemen. So you can imagine what they are. Epidemics, violent revolution, war, and there's one other equally terrible. So basically what Scheidel found was that if you flattened everyone, then you flatten out unequal distribution. But then it would start mounting up again. No evidence whatsoever that any non-violent or non-catastrophic interventions ameliorated inequality to any measurable degree. And so, well, so that's what Rule 1 is about, essentially. I elaborated a bit. Everything I told you won't be in what you're going to read, but a bunch of things I didn't tell you are. Part of the reason I wrote it, and you know, I've taken some humorous flack and some not so humorous flack about the claims that I made in Rule 1 because I talk about lobsters. And the reason that I talk about lobsters is because I was reading, I've read a lot of animal experimental psychology, neuroscience, that sort of thing, basic neuroanatomy, functional neuroanatomy, brain chemistry. I'm very interested in the really solid biological end of psychology, as well as the more abstract clinical psychological theories. That's sort of the two places I've drawn most of what I know from. And I was reading some great papers about crustacean nervous systems 15 years ago or so. And crustaceans have a pretty simple nervous system compared to ours and fairly large neurons, and so you can map them out pretty well. And like a crustacean lobster, it's a lot simpler than a person, neurologically speaking, but it's pretty damn complicated thing, you know. I mean, it lives autonomously, it hunts, it can recognize friend and foe, it knows where its burrow is. Like it's got a very wide range of complicated behaviors, so you don't want to think that a lobster is too simple. I mean, they've been around for somewhere between 300 and 600 million years, so, you know, in one form or another. So they're doing just fine. Anything that lasts that long is not stupid. So, but lobsters organize themselves into hierarchies, you know, and while hierarchy is the consequence of unequal distribution of resources, essentially, there's no difference between those two things. And I was really interested in that because of the problem of hierarchy and the problem of inequality and the problem of disproportionate production and all of that, and the fact that so I started to study the neurology and the neuropsychology and the neuropharmacology of the systems in our brains that govern our responses to hierarchy. And so this is another piece of evidence that we can't lay hierarchy or inequality or disproportionality at the feet of the political system, because your brain is so adapted to hierarchy, you cannot believe it. So there are modules in your brain. That's a good way of thinking about it. Or more like the underlying substructure, like the foundational substructure that's 1/3 of a billion years old, which, by the way, is way older than trees. Like, that's old. You basically share it with crustaceans. So crustaceans have a counter in their brain. You know, that's an oversimplification, but it'll do. They have a counter in their brain that tells them where they are in the lobster hierarchy. And if they're a 1, which means they're very, like, low-level lobsters, then they're kind of timid, and they crouch down, and they sneak around, and they don't like to draw much attention to themselves, and they're easily startled. And if they come up to another lobster, they'll tail flick the hell out of there. Their mantra is better ignored and at the bottom than dismembered and dead. And that's a good mantra for dominant hierarchies in general. And then the lobsters, as they move up, say the 10-strata lobster hierarchy, they stretch out, and they occupy more and more space. So like 2 lobsters of equivalent size, one who's a number 1 lobster, one who's number 10 lobster, will occupy different amounts of area, because the number 1 lobster stretches out and looks bigger than he is, let's say, because he's confident, because he's 1 all the time, whereas the number 10 lobster scrunches down. And so I thought that was very interesting, because I knew that there's an analogy between human depression and low position in primate dominance hierarchy structures. So, and the analogy seems to be that what happens when you get depressed? Well, sometimes if you're low status, you're depressed. But sometimes, if you're depressed, you act like you're low status, even though you're not. And that's not a bad definition of depression. And it's actually a good way of thinking about what's happening functionally and neurochemically. And so, and then I was so that was interesting. And I found out at the same time that in the lobster, the neurochemical serotonin, which is a fundamental neurochemical, the serotonergic system is very, very ancient. And when you're in utero and your brain is being set up, the serotonin system sets it up. And it regulates your emotions, serotonin. So in some sense, what it does is determine how much positive emotion you feel compared to how much negative emotion. And those are separate systems, by the way. So happiness is not the opposite of sadness. There's a system for happiness, and there's a system for sadness. And they inhibit each other, but it's not one system. So you can have very high levels of negative emotion and very high levels of positive emotion. So if you take a Big 5 test, and you're really high in neuroticism, and you're really high in extroversion, then you're someone who has very high levels of negative emotion and very high levels of positive emotion. So that can happen. what serotonin does is that as your serotonin levels increase, your sensitivity to negative emotion increases and your sensitivity to positive emotion decreases. And so people hate that. And no wonder, right? Like, of course you hate that, because all the pleasure and hope goes away and all the pain and anxiety is magnified. And that's proportionate to your position in the dominance hierarchy. So as you move up, your serotonin levels increase, you stretch out, you stand tall and proud, let's say, and you're more susceptible to positive emotion, hope, and less susceptible to negative emotion. And as you plummet down the dominance hierarchy, which happens if you're defeated or humiliated or embarrassed or you lose a promotion at work that you were expecting, or well, you run into one of those situations in life where things fall apart on you. Serotonin levels fall, posture droops, and your negative emotion starts to get out of control. And so, and the fact that it's a staggering thing that physiochemical response has been maintained for 1/3 of a billion years. Right? And that shows you, it also helps you understand why people don't like humiliation. You know, lots of people don't like to public speak. It's one of the most common fears. More common than the fear of death, by the way. And the reason that people don't like to public speak is because, well, you're in front of a hierarchical group and exposed to the evaluation of the group. And people don't like that. And, well, we just explained why. And people don't like it when their belief systems are challenged either. And I thought about that for a long, long, long time. And there's one psychological theory that's called terror management theory. And the idea is that you have a belief system to make sense out of things in the world. And as long as it remains intact, and you can make sense of things in the world, then you don't feel an overwhelming sense of existential anxiety. And if someone comes along and mucks about with the axioms of your belief system, and you don't have an explanation for things, then you get overwhelmed by anxiety, and that's why people cling to their belief systems. But I have a better theory than that, I think, and that is that your competence, like, okay, so let's say, well, I'm a university professor, hypothetically, that means I'm slotted into a dominance hierarchy, and at a pretty high level. It's like being a university professor is a pretty damn good job, you know, because it's very secure, which is a good thing, and it's very prestigious, so that's also a good thing. Now, so I can see myself in that hierarchy, you know, in the number 2 or number 3 position, whatever it happens to be, somewhere approximately close to the top, and I have a claim on that position. Now, I have a moral claim on that position. And hypothetically, and it's a position that other people want, so it's very competitive. It's any attempt to find a high status job is extraordinarily competitive. Right? And it's not surprising because they're prestigious positions, they're secure, and they're economically advantageous, so, and they're scarce, so of course there's competition. So, hypothetically, you win some sort of contest in order to be awarded that position. Also, what would the contest be? It might be, well, I know enough to justify being put in that position. And then someone stands up in a question period, say, and puts me on the spot and indicates that my knowledge about something is less thorough than I might have been claiming. You might say, well, that's shaking my belief structure. But more accurately, I think what you'd say is that weakens my moral claim to the position in the actual hierarchy that actually protects me rather than the belief system that I use to construe the world. You know, like being in an actual hierarchy slotted near the top isn't only psychologically advantageous, right? It's actually advantageous. It actually is more secure. It actually is, there are economic benefits that come along with it. It is a prestigious position. None of that's merely psychological. And so people don't like having their incompetence displayed in public before their peers because it threatens their moral claim to their position in the hierarchy, and that position stabilizes their emotions. And so that took about 25 years to figure out. So, a moral, I guess. The moral of the story is the point of the story, and the point of the story is the direction of the story, and the direction of the story is a moral injunction. Because a moral injunction is, go that way instead of that way, right? Or maybe it's, well, it turns out that that way is up. That's actually more of a moral injunction, because you might think, well, you'd like to move up. Well, maybe you want to move down, although I wouldn't recommend that. Although people do aim it down sometimes, like the kid in Florida yesterday, right? Who was aiming very seriously at down. And so people do aim it down, but you might think that aiming it up is better, but you might not know which way up is, and the moral of the story is a pointer to which way is up, and each of the rules in my book is a pointer to which way is up. And you know, I wouldn't say the rules themselves are particularly unique or original. I didn't actually try to make them either unique or original. I tried to make them rock solid and obvious, and then explain why they were so necessary. Because, well, generally speaking, if something's sort of self-evident, you don't have much of a rationale for it. You don't need it. It's like, well, everyone knows that. It's like, well, it turns out you don't really know it. You just accept it because everyone else does, and that's usually good enough. But so in 12 Rules, one of the things I suggested was, well, you've got this problem of hierarchy, right? And the really catastrophic consequences of failure, and the disproportionate advantages of success, and the stress that that puts on social systems. You might say, well, we'll go for radical egalitarianism, but there's no evidence that that works, and plenty of evidence that it has catastrophic outcomes. And plus, if you get rid of hierarchies, then you don't have any up. Because one of the advantages of a hierarchy is it says, well, A is better than B. And you might say, well, if A is better than B, then some people are better at A than at B, and then you get inequality. But if nothing is better than anything else, then what the hell? Why live? Right? You got no aim. If one thing is no better than another, then you're nihilistic and depressed, because you must just sit there and age. You know, well, you starve, because what the hell's the difference? If everything is equal, then there's no impetus for action. And this is actually a technical truth, by the way, because we know how positive emotion systems work. We know a lot about them, and I think the person who did the best work on that was Jeffrey Gray, who wrote a book called The Neuropsychology of Anxiety, which is on my reading list on my website. It's a brilliant book. It will only take you about 6 months of 4-hour days to read. He must have read 3,000 scientific papers to write that book. And not only did he read them, he actually read them, and he understood them. He actually took the time to understand them, and then he synthesized them, and then he did it accurately, and that's like, that just never happens. And so you know, this neuropsychology of anxiety is 20 years of a top-rate genius's work condensed into 300 pages, and it's not something you can just pick up and scan through, because every sentence is a learning experience. But Gray did a really nice job back in 1982, and things have changed to some degree since then, but not a lot, in laying out the function of the positive emotion system while he was discussing the neurological basis of anxiety. It turns out that most of the positive emotion that people experience is not as a consequence of attaining a goal. It's more a consequence of noticing that you're moving forward towards a goal that you desire. So we have a system, it's called a consummatory reward system, that makes you feel good when you get something you want. So, for example, if you sit down at Thanksgiving and you eat a turkey, afterwards you're feeling satisfied. So it's a satisfaction system. You're feeling satisfied. And that's a kind of good, but it's not excited, hopeful, and engaged. That's a whole different kind, and that's a better set of positive motivations. And we know that because people preferentially like drugs that produce that effect. Cocaine does that, amphetamine does that, methamphetamine does that, alcohol does that if you're predisposed to alcoholism. It activates the psychomotor exploratory system. It's dopaminergically mediated. That's the dopamine system. And the drugs that people really like don't make you feel satisfied, so like you sit around after you've had a giant turkey. They make you feel like you're doing something that makes life worth living. And that's what cocaine does, even though cocaine doesn't make life worth living. It certainly provides the simulation of that. And so what the upshot of that is, and this is a theme that is woven throughout 12 Rules for Life, is that no goal, no aim, no up, no hierarchy, no positive emotion. So that's something that we also really need to keep in mind, because hierarchies have this terrible price, right, which is that people stack up at the bottom. But if there isn't a hierarchy of value, so that one thing is better than another, well, what the hell's all you're striving for? And I think that it's actually even worse than that, and this is another motif that runs through the book. It's like, people often ask, does life have a meaning? And that's actually a fairly ill-formulated question, because the answer to that is self-evidently yes. What's the meaning? Pain and anxiety, right? And the reason I use those as self-evident is because even if you're a cynic, like a nihilistic cynic, a hopeless nihilistic cynic, think life has no meaning, it's like you're wrong. Because hold as you will to that theory, you will still be in pain and anxious. And you might say, well, that's not a meaning. It's like, yeah, actually it is a meaning. It just happens to be a negative meaning. But it's not neutral. It's a meaning. And so the question, does life have meaning, is more like, does life have meaning in spite of its suffering? And the answer to that seems to be, well, it depends on what you aim at. And if you don't aim at anything, then no is the answer. And then the next answer is something like, you have to aim at something that's so valuable that the pursuit of it justifies the suffering and the anxiety. And so that actually means you need a pretty damn steep hierarchy of values. Some things have to be way better than other things, because otherwise there's not enough force in their pursuit to produce enough engagement in life to overcome the catastrophe of life. And you might say, well, why overcome the catastrophe of life? Well, there's a bunch of answers to that. One is, well, you'll be in your own little hell if you don't. And so, unless that's what you want, then I wouldn't recommend it. But that's only the beginning of things. And this is something, 12 Rules for Life is in some way a very, very dark book. Like I make a very, in chapter 6, for example, which is put your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. There's a full explanation of what happened yesterday in Florida. You know, because I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out just exactly how is it that you have to think for several months or years in your brooding obsession about the structure of the world before you decide that it's a really good idea to pick up a semi-automatic rifle, and go into high school and shoot a bunch of innocent people. Or maybe worse, you go in Connecticut and it isn't high school kids you shoot, it's elementary school kids. Just to put that extra maraschino cherry on top of your delightful confection of evil, right? Because well, high school kids, well, they've probably done at least something wrong. Those elementary school kids, they're getting as close to innocent as you could possibly manage. And so if you're particularly negatively inclined and you have your reasons, then the most innocent target is the most attractive. And so if you want to understand that, and you probably should, even though you really don't want to, then you can read chapter 6, because I've tried very hard to put myself in the head of people who do that sort of thing. And I understand why they do it. And part of it is they live lives that are nothing but pain and anxiety. And there's all sorts of reasons for that. Sometimes it's bad luck. Sometimes it's neurochemical accidents. Sometimes it's ill health. It's often tied up with a fair bit of it. Let's call it moral psychopathology. They don't see any positive meaning in life that outweighs the catastrophe of life. And they become not only immersed in their own little hell, which is bad enough, but eventually stewing in that hell leads them to the inevitable conclusion that distributing it as widely as possible, with as much mayhem as possible, with as much evil intent as can be managed in the shortest possible period of time is definitely the right thing to do. And so the thing is that not only does a collapse in the hierarchy of values extract out what might be the positive meaning from your own life, which is bad enough, it sets you on a road. Well, it sets you on the road to hell. That's the right way. There isn't a more accurate way of using metaphorical language to describe that pathway than that. And that's why it's part of what would you say, a realization that at the bottom of belief systems, at the bottom of the way that people construe the world, there are religious metaphors. And at sometimes you need a level of analysis that's so deep that there isn't anything that suffices for the analysis except that level of metaphorical language. And it's certainly the case when you're dealing with people like mass shooters, especially the ones that commit suicide at the end. And that's the sort of flourish too, right? Because you might think, why not just shoot yourself at home and save the rest of us all the goddamn trouble? Right? No, seriously, that's an important question. That's a crucial question. It's like if you're done with your life, why bother with the big display? Who exactly are you trying to convince? And of what? Now, some of it is the desire for post hoc notoriety, because there's a lot of fantasizing that drives that. It's like, well, they'll be sorry when this happens. Common theme in suicidal fantasies, especially among adolescents. They'll be sorry they did X to me when this happens, when they see my, cold body in the coffin, or when they see the mayhem that I've produced. But more, it's a quick route to notoriety. The status, as we've already discovered, is very important to people. And if you can't get it in a positive way, then, well, you could always get it in a negative way. And so, and we do ourselves a great disservice by publishing the names of the shooters. And maybe at some point we'd become mature enough not to do that, but it doesn't look like that time is now. And so these people are also very competitive. It's not like one shooter doesn't know what the previous one was up to. So in Rule 1, I also talk about how to deal with this unequal landscape, and I make a case about maybe you've been bullied when you were a kid. Well, it's highly likely because everyone's bullied as a kid, but maybe you're bullied more than normal, you are a continual target of bullying. That's kind of traumatized you, and so you're not as upward and with it as you might be. It's like, well, what do you do about that? Well, hopefully you can remove yourself from the circumstances that obtained when you were being bullied. That happens often to people as they mature, because you're much more likely to be bullied as a kid than you are as an adult. So sometimes just maturation will do that, but you still might carry the scars of your experiences with being unfairly dominated. Well, you can stretch yourself back up, right? You do that metaphysically and physically. The metaphysical element is something like, well, first it's a recognition. See, the kids who do these terrible things, they're very annoyed at the way the world is structured, because the world contains a tremendous amount of suffering. And they often regard themselves as, what would you call them? Rebellious advocates of protest against the suffering of the world. If you read the Columbine kids' notes, you'll see that. They're the judges of being. They think that because being is contaminated with suffering and with malevolence, that it should be eradicated. That's the essential theory. They allow their own suffering to embitter them. I guess that's the right way of thinking about it. And it's understandable, right? That's the thing. Is that because life really is hard. And some people really have hard lives, like, well, almost everyone has a pretty hard life. If you get right down to it, if you really talk, people have hard lives, You have $100 million, but your father's dying of Alzheimer's. It's like, it's great that you're rich, but, your father's dying of Alzheimer's, and there's nothing you can do about it. And almost everyone has got an ongoing tragedy in their own personal life, as an individual, or is tightly associated with someone who does. And there's not much we can do in some ways to protect ourselves against that, Material wealth alone isn't, like, it's better than poverty, but there's many things it just doesn't address, many of the most fundamental things. There's every reason to become embittered. But the problem is if you become embittered, then everything that makes you bitter gets worse. That seems to be a really bad solution. I spent a lot of time, some of you might have listened to my biblical lectures on Cain and Abel, because that's the story of Cain and Abel, right? Cain gets bitter, and he's angry at God because of the structure of the universe. It's no wonder, But God, as having none of that, basically tells Cain that if he used everything that was in front of him to its proper advantage, then the world that he would inhabit would no longer be characterized by unbearable suffering. And one of the things that I've learned from reading the biblical stories, among other things, and the clinical literature, I would say, is that there's really something to that idea. And I said that 12 Rules for Life is a very dark book, because it lays out, in uncertain terms, the idea, A, that life is characterized by suffering. That's a universal truth. Suffering, pain, and anxiety, to put it in a more differentiated manner. And that pain and suffering is enough to embitter you. And understandably so. So that's the dark status quo, let's say. But then the next question would be, well, do you have any armaments against that, right? What do you use in your struggle against tragedy and evil? And, well, that's courage and truth, fundamentally. And courage, that's partly posture. Because when you stand up and expose yourself to the world, and you've exposed the parts of you that are most vulnerable, it's a confident stance. It's like, have at it, come at me, And that's the attitude to the world. It's a combative stance, but not just that. It's also a trusting stance in some sense, right? Because to hide from people means that you don't trust them. Well, and I've learned something too about the difference between naivete, naive trust, and trust. So like a child who's naive thinks everyone is good, and then maybe will become betrayed and hurt as a consequence. A naive child thinks that everyone is good, and so trusts. But that's not trust, that's just naivety. And it's not a virtue. Even though a trusting child is a lovely thing, it's not a virtue. It's just the absence of experience with betrayal. So like once you're an adult, teenager, let's say, you've been hurt, you've been betrayed, why should you trust? And the answer is never, because people are trustworthy. That's the wrong answer. The right answer is because you're courageous. That's the right answer. And so you meet people with an attitude of trust, knowing what can go wrong, but willing to take that as a necessary cost of potentially bringing out the best in the other person and in you. And I would also say that the empirical data on the utility of that as an approach is also quite staggeringly high. Some of the best analysis of what makes countries rich versus poor have indicated that the level of interpersonal trust in a country is a great predictor of not only economic success, but probability of economic growth. And you can understand why that is, because like how the hell are you going to trade with someone without accruing enforcement costs that will completely obliterate the utility of the trade unless you trust them? Like if I can trust you, I don't have to know anything about you. I don't have to know how full of snakes you actually are. It doesn't matter, because you simplify yourself down to your word, and then we can interact cooperatively. And so I really think that the only natural resource, apart from intelligence perhaps, is trust. And that trust is actually a consequence of courage and not of naivety when it's mature. And I help my clients with that idea a lot. I mean, it's not exactly my idea. I've read the works of most of the great clinicians of the 20th century, and so I've learned a tremendous amount from reading what they had to say. And that idea of courageous trust is that's an unbelievably powerful idea. Especially when you know, because you might think, well, I'm not naive, I'm not going to trust people. It's like, yeah, fair enough, that makes you not naive. That's step one. Naive is step one. Not naive, that's step two. Not naive and willing to trust, that's step three. Right? Then that opens the world up to you again. Say, well, you voluntarily take on the fact that you're vulnerable and that life is tragic and that it's tainted by malevolence. You accept that, and then you decide to move forward and do good despite that. And well, and so part of the conclusion in 12 Rules for Life, although not stated, as a formal conclusion, is that terrible as tragedy is and tainted by malevolence as life is, truth and courage are stronger than pain and despair. And I actually think that's true. I think it's true literally. You see this in psychotherapy, eh? So if someone comes to you and they have like paralyzing levels of anxiety, they can't leave the house, they're agoraphobic. So they're terrified of being in an elevator and getting stuck. They're afraid. What they're really afraid of in an elevator is often people who have agoraphobia are afraid that they'll have a heart attack somewhere they can't get to the hospital. And so then they get afraid of anywhere that they might go where they couldn't get to a hospital quickly. And so that would be taxis, especially in a busy street, subways, theaters, elevators, any place where they might get trapped. And their thoughts are, they've often had heart palpitations, or someone close to them died of a heart attack, or they have a family history of heart disease, or they've recently been through a divorce and have been very anxious because of that and are more cognizant of their mortality. Like, they have their reasons to start becoming anxious, and then they avoid places that they might get trapped, and then they get more and more anxious, and finally they can't even leave their house. And so, when you treat someone like that, you don't make them less afraid, because it's too damn late for that. They're naive to begin with. This is often the case with, it's usually women who develop agoraphobia, by the way. They've often been overprotected by their father or their boyfriend or their husband or whatever have you. And then something comes along that they can't be protected from, like some hint of mortality or the possibility of divorce. And they become extraordinarily anxious, and they come to see a therapist. And if the therapist has any sense, he doesn't say, well, I don't know what you're anxious about. He says, well, of course you're anxious. It's like it's bloody staggering that everyone isn't terrified out of their bloody skulls all the time. Right? It's like, why are people anxious? What a stupid question that is. It's like, really, it's like, why are people anxious? yeah. Why do people drink? Well, you don't need an answer for that. Why do people take cocaine? No, wrong question. The right question is, why don't they take it all the time to the exclusion of all else? Well, that's what isolated rats will do. It's like, we know why people take cocaine. It's perfectly obvious. And so the question with anxiety is, how is it that some people aren't anxious some of the time? And with the agoraphobic, the issue is, well, how do you reinstate that now that they've come to confrontation with their own vulnerability and mortality? That's basically the issue. There's no going back. You know, maybe the person comes and says, well, I've got heart palpitations. I have a family history of heart disease. It's like, I'm terrified. It's like, well, there's nothing. You probably won't have a heart attack. It's like, oh, hey, thanks. I probably won't die. You know, it's just, once that specter appears in front of you, probability is irrelevant. Well, so what do? Is you teach people to live in spite of that. You teach them to be courageous, not to be not afraid. You teach them to be brave. And the way you do that is you show them that there's more to them than they thought. So, you know, you do this with behavioral exposure, for example. So let's say you want to take an agoraphobic, hasn't been in an elevator for 3 years. And so, you know, maybe they work on the 15th floor. This is actually, and they're getting older. It's actually a problem, right? You've got to take the damn elevator. And there's a whole complex of fears associated with the elevator. So you say, well, you know, what are you afraid of? And they say, well, I'll have a heart attack. The elevator will stop, I'll get stuck, I'll panic, I'll have a heart attack, and I'll die. And there'll be 3 other people in the elevator, and they'll make a fool of myself while I'm dying, and they'll all point at me and laugh. And that's kind of the complex of fears, right? Because it's social humiliation, which people hate, plus death. And so you get those two together, you have a really walloping fear complex going. I'm going to die slowly and stupidly while lots of people are gathered around watching. So I had an agoraphobic client once, and so the way you treat someone like that is to say, okay, well, let's pick some. Write down the 10 things you're really afraid of. With number 1 being the thing you're most afraid of, and number 10 being something you're pretty afraid of. And so let's say they list elevators as number 10. Say, okay, we're going to start with number 10, because we're not going to make this any more difficult for you than it has to be. Then you say, look, there's no tricks to this. The person has to trust you. I treated someone with a needle phobia a while back, and this person had a needle phobia that was so intense that he would have dental surgery without anesthesia. So, right. So, you know, that's a phobia, man. If you want the definition of one, that's one. Yeah. And, you know, I brought a needle into the office. And well, I told him the week before, I'm going to bring a needle into the office, and it's going to be sitting on the shelf right there. And when you come in next week, I'll show it to you, and you'll know where it is, because you don't muck about with your clients. They have to know exactly what's going on. And then what I did with him was practice. I let him practice leaving. I said, because I want you to, you're in control of this. That was the rule. You're in control of this. I'm going to pick up that needle, but not until I tell you. And if you want me to stop at any time, I will stop. And if you want to leave at any time, you can just leave, and I won't interfere with you leaving. And so I have him practice like 10 times, telling me to stop and leaving. Because just telling him that wasn't enough. It's kind of like practicing something with pretend play with a child, right? To act it out with them is better than just to tell them, which is a good thing to know if you have children, by the way. So I let him practice that like 10 or, till he was bored with it, till he knew what the drill was, right? And then, you know, I'd say, well, I'm going to pick up this needle, now I'm going to move it 4 inches, and he'd not want to look at it, so you got to look at it. You got to look at it. That's the thing, is you got to look at the terrible thing, right? And then you dissociate it from all the terrible things you imagine it might be. And so it took about 6 sessions, something like that, before he could go to the hospital and have a needle, which was a big deal. But, okay, but what happened, you see, wasn't that he got less afraid of needles, is that he got braver about them.
Yeah.
And so, so the person who has the elevator problem, so this is what happens. So you say, well, look, how about looking at some pictures of elevators? And they say, yeah, I think I can handle that. Or maybe they don't. Maybe that's enough. Say, okay, well, let's look at 100 pictures of elevators. You'll get bored of it sooner or later. And so, and you want to get bored of it, because if you're bored of something, you're not anxious about it. So it's like, well, here's a picture of an elevator. How are you feeling? Well, you know, I can feel my heart rate accelerating and I'm breathing more heavily. It's like, okay, we'll just keep looking at it until that stops. It'll stop. If the person doesn't run away, that'll stop in 5 minutes or so, because the anxiety system sees the feared object and thinks, And then it scans to see if anything additionally terrible happens. And if the answer is no, then it shuts down. But if the answer is you run away, then the anxiety system thinks, well, that must be a predator of some sort, because otherwise why would you run away? And so if it's a predator, then you're afraid of it, and running away makes you more afraid. So if you just wait it out, then you're bigger than the thing you're afraid of. That's what you're teaching yourself. And so then maybe it's pictures, and then you take them in the hallway and you say, see that elevator over there? Can you stand being this close to it? And say no or yes, and if it's no, you say, well, we'll go 10 feet farther back, whatever. You stand there and watch it open and close for a while. Just imagine that you're near it and watching. It's like, you don't want to do that. Keep your eyes focused on it. You got to look at it. We'll just do that till you're bored. It doesn't take very long. Then you move them 5 feet closer, and then 5 feet closer, and then 5 feet closer. Sooner than they think, almost inevitably, they're like right up by the elevator. And you say, well, we'll let the doors open. You can take a quick look inside, and that'll be enough for the day. And so, it's fine. So then they do that, and come back the next time, and maybe the next time you say, okay, look, we're going to start a little back from where we were. We'll get you up to the elevator. I'm going to open the door, and you're just going to put your head inside and look around. But look everywhere. Look at the corners, look at the numbers. Make sure you bloody well know that where you are is in an elevator. Can you do that? Yes. And like 3 sessions, something like that, you can get the person going down 1 floor, generally speaking. Now, the psychoanalysts believe that if you did behavioral treatment of a phobia like that the phobia would just reappear somewhere else, because they thought the phobia represented something deeper, like fear of death, which it actually does. But it turns out that if you do behavioral exposure like that with people, the bravery generalizes. The phobia doesn't. The bravery generalizes. So one of the things that's commonly reported among women who are treated for agoraphobia is that they start to fight with their husbands. Right, because they're dependent, right? They're dependent. They don't want their husband to leave because they're afraid. And so because they're dependent and afraid, they won't put forward what they want. So then if you teach them that they're actually tough enough to go into an elevator despite being terrified of dying, which is actually a pretty good thing to learn about yourself, right? It's like, oh, look at that. I can move forward despite the fact that I'm terrified of dying. I can actually still move forward. It's like, there's a hell of a lot more to me than I thought. Well, once you know that, then you can get in a taxi and you can take a bus. And you can tell your husband what the hell you wanted to tell him for the last 15 years. And so that often causes disruptions that are secondary to the treatment. You know, but the thing is that courage generalizes. And people can be unbelievably courageous. And the funny thing is you don't know that until you put yourself in a situation where it's demanded of you. And so, I had another client who was afraid of life. That's really the truth. And I took her to an embalming, and she was so afraid of death that she couldn't go into a butcher store. So, in a butcher store, well, you think that's pretty, if you really think about it, it's a pretty damn grotesque place. Right? I mean, it's a place of death, obviously. And you're blind to that for whatever reason, but she wasn't. It was like, this is a place of death. I'm not going there. And the consequences of that fear were radically destroying her life. And she had a dream that indicated that if she didn't learn to live in the slaughterhouse, she wouldn't survive. That was basically the upshot of the dream. And we boiled that down to, I asked her, what could we do that would be equivalent in some sense to visiting a slaughterhouse, because that seemed to be out of the question. She said, well, I'd like to see an embalming. I didn't know how the hell I was going to arrange that, but it turns out if you call a funeral parlor and you tell the people there that you have someone who's terrified of death and that they need to do something about that, the people who work in the funeral parlor are actually quite familiar with that. And then people who work there think about what they do. It's like they deal with death all the time, right? All the time. They deal with death and grief all the time. And they do it. It's like, it's unbelievable that they can do that. And people who work in palliative care wards do that. And people who work in emergency wards and people who are paramedics. They're like facing this bloody catastrophe, just never ending parade of calamity. And they do it. It's like people are pretty damn tough. So that's a pretty remarkable thing. And so, see, I didn't get past rule 1 tonight, so that's but it doesn't, the thing about, I guess each of the rules in the book are they kind of contain each other rule. That's one way of thinking about it. The motifs are quite similar as you work in the chapters. And the fundamental motif of the book is something like, well, what I just laid out is that, and this is a message of optimism, and I actually think this is why so many people are watching my lectures, as far as I can tell, because like, I'm a dark guy, man, and I have a really optimistic idea, you know, because I've spent my whole life studying the worst possible things that people can do to each other. And there are things that people do to each other that are so bad that you can't even imagine it. And that's a rough thing to say, because like, we have pathological imaginations, and if you let those things cycle, you can imagine some pretty dreadful things. But believe me, there are things that people have done to each other that a normal person could not imagine doing. And there are things I've read, especially about what happened when the Japanese invaded China in World War II, that are so dark that you can't read them without being permanently affected by it. And, you know, I've helped lots of people through very difficult periods of their lives, and spent a lot of time studying totalitarian atrocity on the right and the left. It's like, it's pretty damn harsh, you know. But what I've come out of from that, see, Carl Jung knew something. His motif, it was an alchemical motif. He derived it from the study of alchemy, and it's a Latin motif. Inster quolinus invenitur, which means that which you most need will be found where you least want to look. And that's a hell of a thing. That's the barrier to enlightenment, by the way. Because you think, well, perhaps people could be enlightened, and, well, what's stopping them? Follow your bliss, as Joseph Campbell said. I guess he revised that. I heard that the other day, to follow your blisters. Which, I think he actually said that, knowing that he had maybe glossed over the problem a bit too glibly. But that wasn't Carl Jung. Jung's idea was, you do what's meaningful and truthful. It'll take you to some really, really dark places. And that'll straighten you the hell out. And that's about right. And so what I found by investigating the darkness was that it clarified the light at the same time. That makes sense, right? Because it makes sense. How could you understand good without understanding evil? And if you don't think there's evil, well, then God help you, because one day you'll encounter someone who's malevolent and they will tear you into pieces. And that happens to people far more frequently than you think. In my clinical experience, I've never seen someone with post-traumatic stress disorder who hadn't encountered evil. That's what causes post-traumatic stress disorder. Like, it is a trauma. You know, kids fall and break their legs, they don't get post-traumatic stress disorder. You're naive on some part of your life, and you hit someone who's malevolent, and maybe it's you. Because that's often a cause of post-traumatic stress disorder too, among soldiers in particular. They watch themselves doing something they cannot imagine that they could do, and they do it. It's like they never recover from that. So you know, the world is a tragic place, and it's a malevolent place. And we each have our personal tragedy and our family tragedy, and we're each carriers of malevolence and recipients of it, and that's the landscape of reality, essentially. But there are modes of conducting yourself in the world that are more powerful than tragedy and evil. And those involve courage. So that's the first thing. The courage is something like the willingness to voluntarily take on the burden of the tragedy and malevolence, to accept it, rather than to fight it. To accept it as a condition of being. It's something like that. You have to accept it as a condition of being. I read this really interesting old Jewish commentary years ago. I don't even remember the source, but it was one of the most brilliant things I've ever read. The commentator was discussing the classical attributes of God: omniscience, omnipotence, omnipresence. So that's everything, fundamentally. The question was, what is a being that's omniscient, omnipresent, and omniscient lack? An obvious answer is nothing. That's not the correct answer. The correct answer is limitation. Oh, that's so amazing. That's such an amazing thing, is that limitation has advantages that totality lacks. Limitation means there's something to struggle against. Limitation means there's a place to go. There's an up. There's a story. There's an adventure. All of that requires limitation. And that's life. It's an adventure of sorts. And it's a terrible adventure. It's a high-stakes adventure. Because you're all in, man. Whether you like it or not, you're all in. That's the adventure. Then the question is, well, is it worth it? And then the answer to that might be, well, it depends on the quest. Right? Maybe that's the answer. It's like if the quest is sufficient, then the adventure is worth it. And so that's the only optimistic thought that I've ever come across that I actually believe. Really, it's like that could be true. And it seems like that. If you live that out in your life, you know, sometimes you have days where you think, oh, that was really worthwhile. And you think, well, what does that mean? It means that, well, despite the terrible preconditions of being, that seemed to announce itself as valuable. You think, okay, well, what if that was your pursuit, period? You think, well, I'm going to pursue what I regard as the most valuable thing. I'm going to dedicate myself towards that so that I have the adventure of my life that justifies the suffering of my life and the malevolence that's part and parcel of existence. They aim so far up that the trip is worthwhile. It's like, there's absolutely every reason to believe that that's the proper answer. Like it looks like it is, that's what the great stories say. No, that's what the great ethicists say. That's what the archetypes demonstrate. That's what the neurobiology suggests. That's what our attempts to produce political structures that are stable and relationships that work suggest, because you treat each other in a relationship as if you love someone, you treat that person as if the adventure of their life is worthwhile. It's something like that. You wouldn't love them if you didn't think that, would you? You would, if you didn't think it was worthwhile for them to be, you wouldn't love them. So it's a judgment call you make. It's like, well, it seems to me that it's a good time for everybody to wake up and realize that. It's like, life is terrible, worse than you could possibly imagine. And history is an absolute madhouse, catastrophe. But the nobility of the human spirit and the power of courage and truth is sufficient to transcend all of that. And I think that's true individually, like in the confines of your own life. I think it's true for your family, because you can have a beneficial effect on your family. I think it's true for you in relationship to the community. And I have a sneaking suspicion, and this is when my thought goes beyond its ability to justify itself. It's more out of an intuition, a profound intuition, that you can set yourself together so well that you start pulling other things outside of the family and the community together properly around you. So they start to line up, so that everything starts to line up and come together like something symphonic. And we don't understand the relationship between consciousness and reality very well. There's obviously a reciprocal relationship. And it's possible that each of us play a much more fundamental role in the structure of being than any of us really realize. We certainly are far more than we can understand. Like what the hell do we know about ourselves? This is one complicated. It's just beyond belief. It's like, what are we exactly? Well, might be fun to find out. And the alternative seems to be something like good as hell. And so, why not aim up? So, that's probably a good place to stop. I would say, well, why the hell not aim up? We can do that, man. That would be really good. And I think everybody's ready for it. So it's like, let's bloody well do it. Truth and courage. That would be a good thing. So thank you.
Everyone's attention, please, or if you're going to leave, please leave quietly. start at the mic at the end over there.
Very well. All right. So, that's public speaking. Those of you who are going to speak publicly, never talk when your audience is making noise. You just give them permission to make noise. So when you go in front of a crowd, you wait until it's dead silent, until everyone's a little bit wondering why the hell you're not saying anything. And then you can talk. That's much better. So, there you go. Public speaking. Okay, so you won't know whether to clap or not at the end of each question, but don't, because then we'll zoom through the questions. We can have more of them that way, so let's just leave that till the end. So, hi.
So I've had quite a bit of trouble articulating this question. I'll try to push through as fast as I can. I think it has something to do with what you say about the Holy Grail and also nightclubs. I know that's a weird combination. Every now and then my friends, drag me to a nightclub, and it's a source of tremendous anxiety for me, and when I go there...
That's why you have to drink at a nightclub. That's so you can do stupid things and not regret it at the moment.
It's exhausting to a sense because I feel depressed for like 2 days after. But there have been moments where I've had brief spells of, sort of a bliss there, right? And it's really easy for me to be cynical because when I'm there, I'm always looking at people and thinking, oh, it's just a bunch of idiots trying to get laid, or a bunch of girls looking for attention, or something like that. But I also feel like there might be something there that I don't understand. It's like a dark spot in my map, And so I was wondering more generally, how can you distinguish between a cave that's empty and a cave that has a dragon in it, and also what you generally think about nightclubs, because I think that would be funny. And it's not nightclubs specifically, they're more of a microcosm of something else.
Well, I'd say I'm probably generally in favor of them. I mean, it's good that people go out and have fun. I mean, fun is dangerous, right? I mean, alcohol is dangerous and sex is dangerous and all of that, but you can't regulate any of that too tightly because then the regulation gets to be more dangerous than the danger. So that's a big problem. One possible solution to that is that there's a chapter in this book called, it's chapter 10, Be Precise in Your Speech. And it was a fun chapter to write because it's a description of how what you're aiming at determines your world. And I didn't want to make, that's kind of a metaphor, Buddhists believe, for example, that the reality that you inhabit is Maya, or illusion, and that your suffering is a consequence of being mired in that illusion. And there's some real truth to that, because what you want does determine how the world manifests itself to you. Now, it's not the only determinant, because we really are limited in some ways, right? I mean, you can be bouncing along quite happily and doing everything right, and there's an earthquake and a building falls on you, and that's the end of that. So, you're bounded by your mortality, but within that you have, what would you say? You have a landscape of choice. And then the way that landscape manifests itself is in no trivial manner determined by what you're aiming at. So there's a story in that chapter about this woman. She meets a psychiatrist at a party, if I remember correctly. It's from a play called The Cocktail Party by T.S. Eliot. And she tells the psychiatrist that her life isn't going very well, that she's suffering and thinking dark thoughts about how terrible things are. And she's hoping that he can help her, but before she gets to that, she says, I really hope there's something wrong with you. And the psychiatrist says, well, what do you mean? Why do you hope there's something wrong with you? And she says, well, look, I'm suffering madly. And as far as I can tell, there's only two possible reasons for that. One is there's something wrong with the world, and I'm just stuck with that, and hence the suffering. Or maybe there's something wrong with me, and that would be way better, because then I could go I'm not going to fix the world. I could potentially fix me, and some of the suffering would go away. It's like, and then when I read that, I also thought about what happened repeatedly in the Old Testament, because what happens in the Old Testament repeatedly is that the Israelites kind of get their act together, and they sort of get things going, and then they get all arrogant and start breaking rules, and then God comes along and just wallops them for like centuries. Right? They're all flattened, and they kind of slowly get themselves off the floor and climb up again, and then they get all arrogant and they're flattened again. But what's really interesting isn't the rise and the flattening, which is kind of part and parcel of life, but the Israelites' response to them, which is always to blame themselves and not God. That's one of the things that makes that book so unbelievably rock solid. The Israelites always think, no, catastrophe, it's because we didn't do things right. Catastrophe, it's because we didn't do things right. It's like, even if that's not true, the thing is, it is true. But even if it's not true, it's like it's a pretty good attitude. It's a pretty good attitude to have. It's like, well, even, and I've noticed this when people are negotiating with their partners, say, it's like, if you're having a real dispute with your partner, one really effective technique is to separate, because like you have this dispute, you're trying to hammer each other. It's like, separate, go sit on a bed somewhere and think, okay, despite the fact that I'm married to the most annoying person in the world, and clearly, completely wrong in this instance, is there anything that I've done, no matter how trivial in the last months, that have made this stupid situation more probable? And like if you ask yourself that question, it takes about 15 seconds to figure out all the dumb things you've done. There's plenty of them. They'll come flooding forward, pretty much in a never-ending stream. And if you go tell your partner, yeah, I'm not very fond of you at the moment, and for sure you're wrong, but here's some really stupid things I've done, then they tend to be a lot happier with you. And if they do the same thing, then you tend to be a lot happier with them. So there's some utility in figuring out what it is that you're doing to muck up the situation. So one of the things I would say with regards to the nightclub situation is maybe it's miserable because what you want when you go there isn't right. And so what I would say, like if we were talking about this in a therapy session, like I would say, well, let's lay out what it is that you're searching for when you go there. And you'd have to kind of write approximations, because you might not actually know. You kind of have some idea, but you wouldn't exactly know. It's okay, let's figure out what it is that you're after. Let's figure out a bunch of things that you could be after otherwise. And then let's send you to the nightclub 10 times and with these different attitudes in mind and see what happens. That's called collaborative empiricism, by the way. It's a behavioral technique, and it's a good one. So I would say, well, vary your approach. Maybe your approach one night could be to dance 30% more than you usually would. But you have to leave everything out of it, everything else out of it, right? It can't be, well, I'm trying to find a partner for casual sex, and that's really my aim, but I'm going to pretend that my aim is to dance like 30% more. No. Wrong. You have to play the game straight, or maybe it's to have 3 engaging conversations. You can quantify it like that. And it's kind of trite in some sense, but you're obviously not a pro at going to the nightclub by your own admission, because it's not working out for you the way that it might. So I would say, change your goals and see what happens. So, because perhaps what you're pursuing there isn't the right thing to pursue. It's highly probable, right? It's highly probable. You all laugh. Eh? It's so funny. So it isn't obvious what you should be pursuing there. But then I would say it's truly not obvious, because the nightclub is a very complex landscape, right? It's a mating market. And it's accelerated mating market in some sense. And you might say, well, what's the optimal behavior in a landscape that's an accelerated mating market? Well, you could think about that for 5 years. The pickup artist types are trying to figure that out too, right? Because what they do is manifest a persona that's associated with success in a rapidly accelerated mating market. But they're not doing the real thing. They're basically, it's a little more complicated than that. But they're probably pursuing a goal that's higher than like cowering at home in your basement, covered with Cheeto dust. But it's still probably, my suspicions are, it's still a suboptimal ethical pursuit. Okay?
see, does this mic work? Doesn't sound like it. As you can see, I'm President Donald J. Trump, or as you might not know, I'm Trump the hippie. So I was born in 1946, older than you. So, but you might be able to help in my quest. In my book, The Art of the Deal, I talk about how I'm not just doctrinaire. I'm trying to bring people together from where they are. Sounds like you've done that in your practice. So here's our big challenge. See if you can help me with that. How are we going to end the war between the sexes? I have an idea how to start off. Because you did mention breastfeeding in one of your speeches I saw online. And right now, that's an unpaid labor. So maybe if women... Hey, I'm the wise crazy guy, you know that. So maybe if women were paid to breastfeed for a start, they wouldn't be so angry at us men.
Okay, so a couple of things. So obviously, the first part of that question is the role between men and women. That's related to the nightclub question, and that's related to the Me Too question, and that's related to the sexual harassment question, and that's related to the glass ceiling question. And there's a profound question lurking under all of this, which is, you know, we're trying to pull everyone's talents into the general marketplace, let's say, for lack of a better word. And there's some real utility in that. It seems stupid to not use the talents of half the population. And I guess that's kind of what we decided with the invention of reliable birth control. It was sort of a collective decision that if we could free women from the inevitability of non-stop maternity, that might be a net benefit to everyone. Now, whether or not that is true, we don't know, because the experiment's only been running for 40 years. But you might think, well, it was an experiment worth running. And then the sexual revolution and all of that, we're still in the throes of that, is a consequence, as far as I'm concerned, of the introduction of the birth control pill, because that's a biological revolution of, you know, I think the 20th century will be remembered for the hydrogen bomb, the microprocessor, and the birth control pill. Those are the three big technological revolutions. The question is, well, how should men and women act towards each other in the workplace? And the answer to that is, well, we don't exactly know. We don't exactly know what the rules are. We don't know how to regulate our sexual behavior in the workplace. I think it has, these are deep ethical questions, like the ethical question of what you're doing when you go to a nightclub. You think, well, that's not a deep ethical question. It's like, yeah, it is. It's pretty much as deep as they get, actually. Because you're asking, well, how should I regulate my sexual behavior when I have choice in the matter? And it's the same thing in the workplace. I mean, this is, in most situations like this, I'm a traditionalist, because I actually think that the best solution to the multiple problems that life throws at you is stable monogamy. I think the evidence for that is overwhelming. Now, exactly how you parameterize that and what leeway you allow people within that framework, well, I'm not wise enough to know. I think you deviate from that path at your peril, and that we deviate from that path as a society at our peril as well. And so, I would say, if you're looking for a cheap thrill, and you think that you can find that in sex, that you're sadly mistaken. That's what it looks like to me. And I think that if people were willing to accept that idea, and I can certainly understand why no one wants to, then the sorts of problems that we see in the workplace would start to tap themselves down quite rapidly. You know, one of the things I tell my younger clients in particular is, you know, back in the 1950s, I wasn't around then, but let's say the 1960s, the default answer to the question, will you sleep with me, was no. And that's a pretty good default. And now it's not so obvious that that is the default, even though I think it should be. But here's a rule of thumb that is a useful one when you're trying to figure out how to advance your sexual interaction in the throes of a new relationship. How about you don't do anything physically with anyone that you wouldn't talk to them about first? I don't mean active consent. I think that whole idea is fabrication of like delusional 13-year-old girls. I do think that, well, because life is a lot more subtle than that, obviously. But I do think that a good rule is something like no physical intimacy without a corresponding emotional intimacy. And I think the reason for that is because you just can't fractionate people. Like we come as a package. And I think that you fractionate off your functions, let's say, at your psychological peril. So, now that's a pretty vague answer, unfortunately. Well, but it's also an all-encompassing question, right? So you're going to get a vague answer to an all-encompassing question. I mean, I also wrote a little bit about that at the end of 12 Rules for Life when I'm talking about the archetypal representations of human beings. In the Christian domain, the archetypal representation of a woman is a virgin with child. And the archetypal representation of a man is a crucified hero. And those are actually pretty decent representations of it. They're overwhelmingly powerful. And you know that because they would have lasted like several thousand years without having overwhelming power. Well, the crucifixion image is an image of the voluntary acceptance of suffering and death and the possibility that's transcendence. And the Virgin Mother is something like the pristine totality of the feminine and the feminine in conjunction with the infant. And those are holy images. And then I would say that if you're not treating each other like you're a manifestation of that holy image, then you're not treating each other properly. You might say, well, that's a pretty high, what we call it, that's an extreme demand. It's like, well, that's okay. Life makes extreme demands. Life is nothing but one extreme demand over another. The reason that those archetypal images exist is because they reflect a reality that can't be transcended. Something like that. And so you violate them at your peril. You certainly do. So, yep. It's a little rough, that answer. That's what you'll have to do.
Hello, Dr. Peterson, big fan. I am doing research on neuroplasticity, and I read Norman George's book on the brain that changes itself to figure forward 12 rules. And I was just wondering why neuroplasticity research hasn't gone mainstream yet in the sense of, talking about, basic psychology classes at the university level.
Well, I think that it is talked about, but I would say it's talked about more on the biological end of the spectrum. Like, there have been studies of neuroplasticity, especially at the hippocampal level, for a very long period of time. But then I would also say probably because it's more of a medical concern than it is a psychology concern specifically. So that's about. It's also a very complicated field. I mean, but it's more psychologists. Unless you go to a clinical school, most of the psychology you take is derived from the experimental realm. So it's not concerned with medical issues to such a great degree. There is plenty of study done on neural transformations that occur as a consequence of learning. So, but not so much with regards to neuroplasticity as a treatment, or exploitation of neuroplasticity as a treatment, which is more what Norman was concentrating on. So, I think it happens more at a micro level among psychologists, but it's there. You just have to look at it more on the physiological end of the literature rather than a straightforward psychological end. So, yeah.
Peterson, this isn't much of a question, this is more of a thank you. 2 weeks ago, I knew things were changing when I walked into the mess deck, and 25 junior divers were sitting around watching a lecture on equity-based politics and what we're facing right now. And additionally, not only for me personally, but from the unit, your explanation of archetypes and post-traumatic stress disorder, you brought a number of people to your back. I'd just like to thank you for that. I present you a small token. It's a clearance diving pin from Fleet Diving Pacific.
Oh, thank you. I want to make a comment about that because one of the things that's happened very frequently over the last 18 months or so is that I've had letters from soldiers, or soldiers have come, members of the armed forces have come up to me during my talks and said that they'd been suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, and listening to my lectures had helped them. And that's a great thing to hear, because post-traumatic stress disorder is like that's not good. It's really not it's a really horrible condition. And it's so interesting because I've treated a number of people with post-traumatic stress disorder who weren't military people, by the way, but it doesn't really matter in some sense. And what I had gathered from that, and this was partly from reading Jung as well, was that people need to, if something terrible has happened to you, it's more than just tragic, because that's not bad enough. Tragedy is bad. Tragedy is when your mother dies of cancer. That's a terrible thing. Malevolence is when someone destroys your life on purpose, or destroys someone else's life, or brings pain when no pain is necessary. There's all sorts of circumstances where malevolence can spring forward, and that really hurts people. And if you have post-traumatic stress disorder, as far as I can tell, the only thing that can bring you back is to develop a religious level philosophy of the battle between good and evil. That's the only thing I've ever seen work. Because, first of all, if you listen to someone who has post-traumatic stress disorder, I had a client, I talked about her a little bit in this book, though I tried to disguise her identity, who was frightened into 3 years of 4-hour-long daily convulsions by the look on her boyfriend's face. That actually happened. Now, she was a very naive person, no thanks to her parents, and she saw a look that meant, I am going to do everything I possibly can to hurt you. And she didn't believe that such a look was possible, being very naive, and that was enough to, when she first came to me, the last diagnosis she had was schizophrenia. That's how badly fragmented she was. And we worked through that in about a year, and she was a lot less naive by the end of that year, I can tell you. But that's been so striking to me, because when you're treating someone with a very serious psychiatric condition, they've been exposed to something brutally terrible. That there's a philosophical cure for that. It's really a theological cure in some sense, but whatever. It's really remarkable that can be the case. But just for people to know that evil does exist in the world is a great relief to people who be confronted by it and have no language to describe it. It's like, yeah, evil exists. It's like, it exists in you. It exists in you. It's real. It's really real. It's more real than anything else, almost, except maybe than good. And it's a relief to people to know that that's actually the case, because then it takes them out of their terrible isolation and puts them back into the common realm of humanity. And also to say, well, not only does evil exist, but it exists in you and in each of us, and the mere fact that it manifested itself in you does not necessarily mean that you're damned for all time, which is really how you feel if you have post-traumatic stress disorder. So that's been extremely interesting, and also great. I mean, it's a wonderful thing to have people who've been hurt so badly and who can't find any respite come and say, well, I listened to your lectures about evil versus tragedy, which I would say is the key lecture in that film, that it's like, help put me back together. It's like, oh, that's good news, man. So, thank you very much. All right.
Thank you for visiting us again in Vancouver, and I also want to thank the UBC Club for doing this event. But I'll get to my question. You had an interview recently with Vice News, and there was
sort of like an interview.
So there was an excerpt that all that they released.
They only talked to me for 2 hours.
Okay, yeah. I ask you about that because the sort of reactions, and maybe people haven't seen this, but the reactions of the people who did see it that I saw was sort of some combination of anger and confusion at that little excerpt that they released. And you were talking about what sort of rules might govern men and women working together in the workplace and a number of related issues. So I wanted to ask you about that interview, what happened in that interview and what happened in that exchange, and maybe give some context to what was going on in that particular exchange that some of us saw.
Well, I think what happened in the interview is what's happening as the traditional media fall to their knees and perish, which is happening at an extraordinary rate. You saw that Canadian newspapers have gone cap in hand to the federal government for subsidy. You know that CBC has 145,000 YouTube subscribers. I don't remember what their yearly budget is, but it's in the, if I remember correctly, it's $1 billion, but that might be wrong. But it doesn't matter. It's a lot. And all they've managed to generate on YouTube is 145,000 subscribers. It's like, which is absolutely abject, 100% catastrophic failure. So, and I think that there's a bunch of reasons for that. I mean, one of them is that there is a technological transformation occurring, right? Because one of the things about YouTube offers everything that TV offers and a bunch of things it doesn't offer, so it's going to win. It's clearly winning already. And so, and then I think that what's happening as the classic broadcast media starts to spiral is their good people start to leave. It's a freedom distribution issue. Their good people start to leave because they can, and then those that remain are less competent, and they get more desperate, and they broadcast more and more opinionated and polarized pieces to attract the remaining audience as they spiral towards zero. And so, well, really, I've seen this happen in large companies. I know how it works, and that's how it works. And so, I think the Vice interview is part of that. And there's other things that are feeding into that. Like, I think, and maybe this is also a consequence of the broadcast medium, is that because broadcast television had a very narrow time frame, you had to cram complex things into small periods of time, so there was a very pronounced tendency for journalists to do all the interpretation. And then that turned into a pronounced tendency for journalists to describe what they thought and what the news was, right? So that they were now the news. Rather, I started noticing this about 25 years ago when, you know, the news would show a politician talking, but the newscaster would be saying what the person said. It's like, well, why have the politician there at all? You might as well just have the newscaster. And that's when I stopped watching television news. And that was really like about 25 years ago. The Vice interview was that sort of taken to its extreme. It was like he had an idea of what the situation was, and he wasn't as aggressive about it as Kathy Newman, but it was the same sort of thing. It was like he was going to cash me out one way or another. And that happened for about 2 hours, and he had kind of a supercilious attitude, which is not uncommon among, let's say, New York journalists. And, you know, and we talked for about 2 hours, and I said something that was provocative, I would say. I said, well, we don't know what the rules governing men and women's behavior, sexual behavior in the workplace should be. I said, well, let's take makeup and high heels, for example. It's like, maybe they shouldn't be allowed. I didn't say they shouldn't be allowed. I said, maybe they shouldn't be allowed. That's actually what you do when you try to think about something. People don't like to think about things. Like, I've really noticed this in my clinical practice. So, like, let's say I'm dealing with someone, and I might say, well, let's think of some options for your future. And they're really nervous, like right away. It's like, no, I don't want to do that. It's like, well, relax. We can talk about a bunch of things, and that doesn't mean they have to happen. Because that's what thinking is like. It's like you can talk about things, and they don't have to happen. But it's not easy for people to make that leap because they get all nervous. They say, well, I don't want to talk about that. It's like, relax. We'll make a rule. We're going to talk about 10 things today that might happen, and none of them are going to happen. Okay? And then people can finally have a bit of courage and maybe think. And what you do when you think is you throw out an idea, and then you think about it. And I thought, well, you know, it's been common practice. Men wear uniforms at work. They wear suits. The suit's a derivation of a military uniform. Why do men wear suits? So they're all the same. Why should they be all the same? So that unnecessary individual variability doesn't interfere with the functionality of the business. Now, you can argue about that. You might say, well, you don't want to make everyone wear the same damn suit because you get rid of all the creativity. Fair enough, that's a reasonable argument, but that's why the uniform, the suit, evolved. And so if you wear a suit and I wear a suit and we go to a business meeting, then the first thing we can figure out is, well, you're at least playing the same game I am enough so that you're wearing a suit. And it's like, that's not everything, but it's not nothing, right? And so, well, and when the Maoists made their advances in China, men and women wore the same uniform. Why? Well, it was for the same reason. It was to eliminate unnecessary individual variability. Well, if you don't want sexual behavior at work, first of all, you've got to decide that. Do you not want sexual behavior at work? Because the answer to that might not be, we don't want sexual behavior at work. You want to work in an environment where romantic entanglements are essentially illegal. That's what NBC has done, right? That's their new policy, is like, if you work at NBC and you know of coworkers who are having a romantic engagement with another coworker, you're obligated to report them to HR. It's like, well, you might say no affairs at work. It's like, okay, you want to put an informer culture in place to impose that, do you? Well, maybe you do, but maybe you should think about it, because the cure might be worse than the disease. It's like, well, like the evolutionary psychology and biology of makeup and high heels is crystal clear. And people disputed that. It's like, well, read the goddamn literature, morons. I mean, you get so sick of this. It's like, these aren't opinions that I'm just trotting out. You know, why do women wear rouge? It's to make their cheeks look like fruit. That's why. We're derived from fruit-eating primates. We have color vision. It's trichromatic. We pick out fruit. It's ripeness. That's what lipstick does. It also indicates a sexual flush. If you don't like that, well, tough luck for you. That's what it is. Now, I'm not saying, and it indicates youth as well, a youthful glow, but that's also associated with sexual attractiveness, because that's one of the prime determinants of sexual attractiveness for women among men. So, now I'm not saying that that shouldn't happen at work. And then high heels. Okay, why do you wear high heels? Well, it's because it tilts your hips so that you're... Is that acceptable at work? Well, of course. It's like, no, not of course. Not of course. Perhaps. But we can't have a serious discussion about what's acceptable at work and what isn't, because we're too damn immature to have the discussion. We can't even throw things out on the table like that. It's like, I don't know what the rules should be. At my workplace, at the university, I've been warned innumerable times not to have a discussion with a student, male or female, but it's the females that are of concern in this particular rule, with the door shut. And that's not like 6 months ago. That's not like 3 months ago. That's like advice from the last 15 years. Now, I don't listen to that because I think, sorry, I'm not living that way. But these things are tense. They're tense. And we won't talk about them intelligently and maturely. You know, I've also been accused 3 times in my career of sexual impropriety. Baseless accusations. And the last one really tangled me up for a whole year. It's not entertaining. So there's plenty to be sorted out, but like I said already, we live in the delusion of a 13-year-old adolescent girl. And so as long as we maintain that level of sophistication, we're not going to have a real conversation about what rules should govern men and women in the workplace. So you can't even open the damn discussion without being jumped on by, a ray of like rabid harpies. So that in a Vice interview, it's like, it's no bloody wonder the media is dying. They're doing everything they possibly can to cut their throats and bleed out as fast as they possibly can. Now, I read a bunch of the comments on the Vice interview, and some of them were irritated at me about the makeup and high heels thing. It's like, well, whatever. I knew perfectly well what I said. I thought, oh yeah, I'll say this, and it's the only goddamn thing. It shows how predictable it was. But most of the comments that I've read so far have been, look, Vice guys, we know what you're up to, and we're pretty much sick of it. And I know that people like Ben Shapiro, he won't appear now if he doesn't lie. And that's a pretty damn reason. Like I said, I was sure. One of the things that really shocked me about Channel 4 in Britain, that was the Kathy Newman thing. So I walked into that after I had a busy morning doing some other things at the studio there. I walked into that, and we met Kathy in the green room, and she was getting all steamed and pricked up, and before she went on camera. That's the truth. Yeah, well, it's funny. when you're on those news shows, because there's always a cloud of people around the hosts, like fixing up their makeup. It's like they're surrounded by bees. They move the hair and they put it, so it's quite comical to watch. And so, anyways, we went out in front of the cameras and we were having a perfectly friendly discussion. You know, she was all chipper and extroverted and having a fine time with it. And then we sat down and we chatted for 2 minutes, and then the cameras went on. It was like, different person. And I thought, oh, I see what's going on here. So, but it's a defunct mode of communication, I think. People are gravitating towards YouTube because it's rough and ready. It's like, this is why Joe Rogan works. It's like, Joe's not all made up. He's he's like the rear end of a smashed up truck. There's no excess production values. There's no bringing the landscape up. It's like, here's the damn discussion, and there's 3 hours of it. If you want to listen, and if you don't, then go to hell. That's basically. And I like that about YouTube. You know, it's also something that's so cool about YouTube too, is you hear this idea that like young people have these short attention spans. It's like, yeah, except when it comes to 3 hour long podcasts. So it's very cool to see this shift, but a lot of it is that it's a death spiral. And I think a lot of the polarization in our society is actually a secondary consequence of the death spiral. It's like because the journalists are more and more desperate, and so they're just generating clickbait, and that's polarizing us. And hopefully that will stop when they die. Well, the thing is, that's a bit harsh, because there have been lots of journalists in the really industry, and I don't want to see the high-quality journalists disappear. But I don't think the high-quality journalists will disappear, because I think their message could move across mediums. But, I mean, when I see CBC, like I watch CBC struggle on YouTube, it's so comical, it's just absurd. It's like that. So I saw something that CBC put on YouTube, it was 10 minutes long, and I wanted to watch it. And so I sat down to watch it, and I clicked, and there were 3 30-second ads. And I thought, that's a lot of ads. for 10 minutes of your damn content. You really think I should pay 1.5 minutes of my time to watch 10 minutes of your content? Then I couldn't click through the ads. It's like, so rule number 1, one ad, 15 seconds long, you can click through it in 4 seconds. That's the rule, not 3 30-second ads that you have to sit through. It's like, have a little respect for the medium. It's like, no respect for the medium. Then the comments were not allowed, disallowed. It's like, no, you should do that because your viewers actually get to make comments. And if you can't hire someone to vet them, you could just leave the damn comments alone. That would be one thing, just let them happen. You know, maybe you need someone to weed out the ones that are like so wretched that, you know, any idiot could tell that, you know, it's what would you call it? Some demented troll who has nothing better to do. You know, but maybe you could just leave them alone. So they won't pay any attention to the media. And so I look at that, I think it's no bloody wonder you guys can't get any traction. You've got no respect for the medium whatsoever. You're not going to make the transition. So I'm irritated at CBC, and that's kind of a good reason too. And that's sort of, I guess, coloring my attitude towards the media in general, but they're in serious trouble. So Vice was a perfect example of that. It's like, you talk for 2 hours, what do? Well, they take the most contentious part of it just to show how damn smart they are. They don't take the people who are watching to see through it, which they could. It's like, to hell with you guys. It's like, that's so cheap and wretched that it's pathetic. It's absolutely pathetic. All you're doing is making things worse.
In Lindsay Shepard's situation, she was smart to record her own side just as insurance from sort of dishonesty from the other side.
Yeah, well, that's another thing that I've often thought about, is just to record the whole interview, you know, but I'm more or less willing at the moment to let the chips fall where they will. And most of the time, there are many people with whom I've sat down and had discussions where things were played straight, and I would say it's actually the majority of them. But there's a pretty pernicious minority that does what Vice did. It's like, there's no excuse for that. There's no excuse for it. It's like, you've got no principles. Let's make this salacious. It's like, these things are important, you morons. It's like, get it together. Don't muck about like that. What the hell do you think you're doing? Well, we need the clicks. It's like, up yours. Seriously, it's so pathetic. It's so pathetic. You can't do it on content, so you'll do it on manipulation. There's the motif of your life. I can't do it on content, so I'll do it on manipulation. The motto of vice.